A millionaire crossed the lobby of his mansion, impeccable as always, until he heard a desperate cry. "Don't touch her, ma'am," was the voice of his maid defending his sick mother. He thought it was a misunderstanding, but what he saw when he opened the door changed everything forever. Before continuing, don't forget to subscribe and leave your like, because what you are about to see will never be erased from your memory. The night was too quiet. Not even the neighborhood dogs were barking. It was as if the Herrera mansion, with its imposing windows and museum-like silence, was breathing secretly, holding its breath. Suddenly, a blood-curdling scream broke the calm. "No, let me go, no!" Alejandro sat up abruptly in his bed. His heart was pounding in his ears like a drum. It was 2 a.m., and that sound could not be mistaken for a nightmare. It was real. Without thinking, he left the room and ran down the hallway, barely lit by the emergency lights. Each step echoed on the cold marble. The scream came from his mother's room. He threw open the door. The scene stopped him in his tracks. Doña Mercedes was huddled against the headboard, trembling, her hands raised as if trying to protect herself. In front of her, Camilla, his fiancée, impeccable in her silk robe, was holding her roughly by the arm. The expression on Camilla's face was one of restrained fury, something Alejandro had never seen in public. "Stop it!" Alejandro shouted as he entered. Camilla immediately let go of the old woman and turned to him with a nervous smile. The same smile that charmed everyone at receptions. "Ale, darling," she got confused. She was about to hurt herself. She was trying to go out into the hallway on her own. Doña Mercedes, however, silently denied it. Her eyes, wet and wide, fixed on her sons, begging for protection. At that moment, the door opened again. Lucia Ramirez, the employee in charge of Mercedes's care, entered agitated, her apron wrinkled from running. "What happened?" she asked, immediately approaching the old woman. She knelt beside the bed and took Doña Mercedes's hands tenderly, murmuring soft words, almost like a lullaby. The old woman gradually began to relax between soothes. Alejandro watched the scene with a mixture of confusion and anger. He couldn't ignore the tension in the air, the difference between Camilla's brusque gesture and Lucia's delicacy. Camilla said in a firmer voice, "Please step outside for a moment." She hesitated. "Alejandro, you really don't understand. I told you to leave." Camilla looked at him with a flash of indignation before obeying. She closed the door too hard, leaving behind a metallic echo. Silence reigned once more, broken only by Doña Mercedes's muffled coughs and Lucia's soothing murmur. Alejandro sat on the edge of the bed, trying to process what had happened. "Mom, calm down, it's over," he whispered, stroking her gray hair. She looked at him with a strange flash of lucidity. Her lips trembled, and she managed to say, "Do you want to get me out of here? You want to get me out." Alejandro swallowed hard. Her words pierced his chest. The disease made her confuse names and memories. But that sentence sounded too specific. Lucia watched him, and for a second, he noticed a silent message in her gaze. Listen to her. That night, as his mother finally fell asleep, Alejandro felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. Fear. Fear of what he had seen in Camilla's eyes. Fear of what was happening under his own roof. Fear of ignoring a truth that had always been right in front of him. He couldn't sleep. He walked through the dark corridors of the mansion with the echo of that scream stuck in his head. And although he tried to convince himself that it had been just a misunderstanding, he couldn't shake the feeling that something had just cracked in his life. What he didn't know was that this crack, this first suspicion, would be the gateway to an abyss that would test everything he thought he knew about love, loyalty, and true greatness. The Herrera mansion shone that night like a palace lit up. The illuminated windows let out flashes of glass and the music of violins. Luxury cars lined up at the entrance while uniformed chauffeurs opened doors with impeccable gestures. In the great hall, everything was arranged to impress. Chandeliers overflowed with golden light. Tables were set with glasses of bubbly champagne, and a discreet orchestra filled the air with classical melodies. The Herrera name was synonymous with economic power, and Camila Guzman knew it. That night was not just a reception, it was a showcase to reinforce her own image. Camilla descended the main staircase dressed in bright red, as if she had calculated every detail to dazzle. Her painted lips seemed designed to smile at just the perfect angle. Alejandro was waiting for her below, impeccable in a dark suit. He took her hand proudly, and together they presented themselves as the couple everyone envied. Alejandro, how fortunate to have you here, greeted a senator, shaking his hand firmly. And you, Camilla, looking more radiant than ever. She laughed softly, tilting her head slightly. She knew how to hold a gaze just long enough to leave an impression. During the evening, Camilla moved naturally among businessmen, politicians, and society ladies. Every word she spoke seemed rehearsed, every gesture measured. Alejandro watched her with satisfaction. She was elegant, charming, the perfect woman to keep the family's reputation intact. But while everyone admired the spectacle, there was an invisible crack in that scene. Doña Mercedes had been seated in a secluded armchair with a blanket over her legs. Lucia remained discreetly by her side, making sure she felt comfortable. The old woman looked at the crowd with lost eyes, trying to recognize faces she no longer remembered. Camilla, in the middle of a conversation with a socialite, glanced quickly at Mercedes. It was only a second, but it was enough for Lucia to notice. Her lips twisted in a gesture of annoyance, a trace of impatience that no other guest noticed. "Would you like some water, Doña Mercedes?" Lucia whispered, leaning over gently. "So many people," the elderly woman murmured uncertainly. "Yes, but don't worry, I'm here." Mercedes nodded slightly, trusting that voice that always managed to calm her. Meanwhile, Camilla raised her glass and toasted a group of investors. She laughed, made witty comments, talked about charitable projects she had never promoted. Lucia, from her corner, watched as the crowd fell for that perfect image. It was like watching an acclaimed actress in her role. At one point, Alejandro brought Camila over to his mother. "Mom, would you like to say hello to some friends?" he asked affectionately, trying to include her. Camilla smiled as she leaned toward the elderly woman. "Of course, Doña Mercedes. Come on." Her smile lasted only as long as it took her to turn her face toward the audience. As soon as Alejandro looked away, the pressure of her fingers on the old woman's arm was unnecessarily strong, almost a tug. Mercedes complained in a whisper that was lost in the hubbub. Lucia saw everything. She took a step forward, her lips parted but held back. She knew that any words at that moment would be turned against her. She simply followed closely, ready to intervene if necessary. The parade of greetings continued. Camilla smiled. The old woman nodded without fully understanding, and Alejandro, distracted by conversations, seemed satisfied with the scene. But Lucia sensed the contrast. The glare of the spotlights against Mercedes's discomfort, Camilla's laughter against the trembling of the old woman's hands. When the round of greetings was finally over, Camilla led Mercedes back to her armchair, almost pushing her discreetly. No one noticed, except Lucia, who immediately approached her. "Are you okay, Doña Mercedes?" she asked, adjusting the blanket over her legs. The elderly woman was breathing heavily. "I don't want to be here. I don't want to be here." Lucia gently squeezed her hands. "It's almost over, I promise. I'll stay by your side." A few feet away, Camilla was once again immersed in the crowd, collecting compliments as if they were jewels. Alejandro followed her with his gaze, proud. For him, that woman was proof that he had made the right decision in getting engaged. But while the orchestra played a waltz and the guests laughed, a silent truth was brewing in the shadows of the mansion. Behind the perfect social mask was a face that very few could see, and with every hidden gesture, every imperceptible grimace, he was discovering it. The morning after the reception, the mansion awoke in a strange silence, as if the music and laughter had been a dream. The servants collected forgotten glasses and arranged wilted vases. Alejandro came down the stairs with a tired face and his mind still caught up in the glamour of the previous night, but something stopped him as he passed the main hall. An 18th century Chinese vase, part of his father's collection, was no longer on its pedestal. "Who moved this?" he asked, looking around. A butler shrugged. "Sir, when we arrived to clean, it was no longer in its place. We found it behind the curtains." Alejandro frowned. It didn't make sense. That object was never moved. He decided to ignore it, convinced that perhaps some curious guest had played with it. However, that was not the only oddity of the day. Later, upon entering his mother's room, he found the drawers of her dresser empty. Doña Mercedes had taken out her clothes and hidden them inside the closet as if she were afraid someone would steal them. "Mom, what happened here?" he asked in surprise. She looked at him with confused eyes and muttered, "I don't want them to take it away from me. I don't want them to." Alejandro tried to smile it off. "No one is going to take anything away from you, Mom. All of this is yours." But the fear in Mercedes's eyes disarmed him. It wasn't a momentary lapse of memory, it was visceral panic. Lucia appeared at the door with a tray of tea. She stopped when she seen what was happening and without saying a word began to pick up the clothes and put them away. Her movements were gentle, almost invisible, as if she knew that any suddenness could increase the old woman's anxiety. "She's been feeling more restless lately," she said in a low voice. "Sometimes she tells me that someone wants to take her away from here." Alejandro pressed his lips together, remembering the words his mother had whispered the night of the scream. "Maybe it's just confused thoughts," he replied, but his tone didn't sound convincing even to himself. That day, rumors began to circulate among the staff. In the kitchen, Alejandro overheard two employees whispering. "Did you see how Doña Mercedes was at the reception?" said one. "Yes, she looked scared, and Camilla never leaves her side in public." They fell silent when they noticed Alejandro's presence. He pretended not to have heard, but the discomfort lingered. That same afternoon, he took his mother for a medical checkup. The doctor, an elderly man with a serious look, calmly examined Mercedes and then took him aside. "Mr. Herrera, Alzheimer's not only erases memories," he said in a calm tone, "it also magnifies emotions. Your mother is extremely vulnerable. The worst damage she can suffer is not physical, but emotional. If she feels rejected or stressed, the disease will progress more quickly." Alejandro listened in silence. The words weighed on him like a judgment. "So what should I do?" he asked. "Surround her with affection, prevent her from perceiving hostility, and above all, don't ignore what she expresses, even if it seems incoherent." On the way back to the mansion, Alejandro watched his mother dozing in the back seat with her forehead resting on the window. He wondered if he was really exaggerating by giving credence to his fears, or if behind that fragility there were signs he didn't want to see. When they arrived, Lucia was waiting for them at the entrance. She ran to help Mercedes out of the car, taking her hands with a tenderness that seemed natural to her. The old woman smiled weakly, as if seeing her provided a point of security amid her confusion. Alejandro noticed it. It was the same contrast he had seen in the early morning. The calm she displayed in seconds was something that took him hours to achieve in the face of uncertainty. That night, as he walked through the hallways, he found something out of place again. A set of keys hidden inside a vase. He couldn't explain it. He couldn't justify it. And for the first time, Alejandro wondered if the mansion that gave him so much pride was hiding deeper secrets than he wanted to accept. The sun slowly descended behind the mansion's gardens, tinging the windows with an orange glow. Outside, the rose bushes were still damp from the afternoon watering. Inside, the stillness of Doña Mercedes's room seemed to belong to another world, more intimate, more fragile. Lucia entered with light steps, carrying in her hands a small wooden box she had discovered that morning in a forgotten drawer in the dressing room. The object was covered in dust, as if it had been waiting years for someone to rescue it. "Look what I found, Doña Mercedes," she said softly, sitting down on the side of the bed. The old woman, who until then had been staring blankly at the wall, slowly turned her head. Her eyes, tired but alert, rested on the small chest. She reached out with a slight tremor, caressing the lid with her wrinkled fingers. "It was mine," she murmured softly, "when I was a child." Lucia smiled, carefully turned the crank, and suddenly the room was filled with a delicate, crystalline melody, as if someone had released a trapped memory. The music rose timidly, with notes that seemed to dance in the air. Mercedes's eyes opened wider. A brief, unexpected laugh escaped her lips. "That song," she whispered in amazement. My father used to play it on the piano back at the farm." Lucia remained silent, letting the echo of the music work its magic. Each note seemed to pull a thread of memory hidden in the old woman's mind. "Would you like to sing it with me?" Lucia suggested, humming the melody. Mercedes hesitated, her lips trembling, but little by little she joined in, stammering broken verses. She forgot some words, replacing them with sounds, but the rhythm was there. It was as if Alzheimer's had taken a step back to allow her to enjoy that moment of clarity. When she finished, Mercedes sighed and let her head fall on Lucia's shoulder. "You remind me of my mother," she said in a broken voice. Lucia swallowed hard, holding back her emotions, and gently wrapped her arms around her, staying by her side and stroking her hand until the old woman's breathing became calmer. The next day, Lucia returned to the room with something different, a photo album she had found in the library. The leather was worn and some of the pages were coming loose with age. "Look, Doña Mercedes, I brought this. Maybe you'll like it." The old woman took the album with curiosity, leafing through it slowly. At first, she didn't seem to recognize anything, but suddenly she stopped her finger on a black and white photo of a girl with braids next to a young man in uniform. "That one," she said, pointing to the boy. "That was my brother. He always made me laugh." Her voice broke, but her eyes sparkled with a lucidity that moved Lucia. "Tell me about him," the young woman encouraged her. Mercedes spoke in pauses about afternoons playing in the fields, about the dog that always followed her, about the blue dress her mother had sewn for her. Each memory was like a window that opened for a moment before closing again. Lucia listened attentively, smiling, encouraging her with gentle questions. In each story, she discovered the woman that Doña Mercedes had been before the disease slowly took her away. One rainy afternoon, thunder rumbled over the roof, and the mansion seemed gloomier than ever. Mercedes was restless, agitated, convinced that someone was looking for her to take her away. "I don't want to sleep. I don't want them to find me," she repeated anxiously. Lucia sat down next to her, took her hands, and began to hum the melody from the music box. Her voice was low, warm, enveloping. The sound mingled with the rain like a protective murmur. "Listen, Doña Mercedes, you're safe here with me. No one is going to take you out of this house." The old woman took a deep breath, her eyelids gradually relaxed, and within minutes she fell asleep with a serene expression on her face. Lucia remained seated, holding her hand, until she was sure she was in a deep sleep. Alejandro watched from the half-open door. He had come up to visit his mother and found the scene. Lucia singing softly, his mother's hand intertwined with hers, the atmosphere of peace that seemed impossible in the midst of illness. He felt a lump in his throat, didn't want to interrupt, closed the door slowly and walked away, wondering why he himself was incapable of achieving that effect on his mother. That night, the table lamp remained on in the room. Lucia, exhausted, fell asleep in the chair next to the bed, her fingers still intertwined with Mercedes's. Even in her dreams, the old woman seemed to cling to that presence that protected her. The rest of the house was silent, as if all the luxury of the mansion had vanished into the darkness. There, in that secluded room, was the true refuge, not in banquets or jewels, but in old songs, forgotten photographs, and the tenderness of a woman who, with infinite patience, managed to restore a little dignity to a fragmented memory. And although the outside world continued to revolve around parties and appearances, Lucia had secretly created a space where Mercedes could feel at home again. The murmur of the orchestra filled the mansion once again. It was the second grand reception in less than a month, and Camilla had insisted that this one had to outdo the previous one. The main hall was decorated with dazzling floral arrangements, warm lighting, and tables that looked like something out of a magazine. The guests, dressed in their finest, wandered the halls with glasses of champagne in hand. Camilla floated among them like the perfect hostess, wearing a deep blue dress and an unbroken smile. She gave the impression of having been born for this stage. She greeted people, laughed, and commented with political precision on every detail she knew would win sympathy. Alejandro accompanied her proudly, convinced that his fiancée carried herself with the confidence of a queen. But on the upper floor, far from the toasts and laughter, another reality was unfolding. Doña Mercedes sat in her armchair by the window, breathing heavily. Her hands were shaking, and she repeated a broken phrase. "So many people. I can't, I can't." The distant echo of the music and the hubbub seemed to pierce her head like needles. Lucia, who had gone upstairs to bring her a cup of tea, stopped immediately when she saw her agitation, put the tray aside, and knelt in front of her. "I'm here, Doña Mercedes. Look into my eyes. Just look at me," she said softly, taking her cold hands. The old woman was breathing fast, almost hyperventilating. Lucia began to hum the same melody from the music box slowly, steadily, until Mercedes's breathing began to match the rhythm of the song. "That's right. Calm down. Everything's fine. No one is going to bother you. I'll stay with you. The old woman's eyelids slowly closed. The tension in her hands eased. When Lucia was sure she was more stable, she took a blanket and gently covered her. In the main hall, the atmosphere was quite the opposite. Camilla raised her glass, surrounded by business people, politicians, and society ladies. Alejandro and I believe in the future, she said in a clear voice. The Herrera family has a duty to represent the values of this country, and we are going to do it together. Elegant applause broke out among the guests. Alejandro smiled with satisfaction, although inside he felt a slight emptiness that he couldn't explain. It was then that Lucia discreetly went downstairs. She approached the service area, trying not to attract attention. From there, she could hear the laughter and toasts, and the contrast with what she had just experienced in Mercedes's room hit her hard. Alejandro excused himself for a moment and crossed over to the kitchen. He wanted to get some air away from the noise. There he found Lucia, who was washing her hands, her gaze still full of concern. "What are you doing here?" he asked curiously. Lucia looked at him hesitantly for a second. "I just came to make her mother some tea." She was a little nervous. Alejandro watched her silently. There was something in her tone that made him pause. "Nervous? How?" Lucia hesitated. She didn't want to sound accusatory. She lowered her voice. The music and the voices upset her, but she's better now. She calmed down. Alejandro nodded slowly. He returned to the living room, but Lucia's words echoed in his mind. He began to look at the reception with different eyes. Camilla shone at the center of it all, receiving compliments. However, on the periphery of the party, her mother was suffering in silence. The contrast was too obvious. A loud laugh pulled him out of his thoughts. A guest patted him on the back. "Alejandro, how lucky are you with this woman? She's made to shine." He smiled politely, but his eyes drifted toward the stairs. For the first time, he clearly felt that there were two worlds in his own home. The one Camila showed to the public and the one she lived in privately with her mother, and those worlds did not fit together. Later, as the last guests were leaving, Alejandro found Camila supervising the employees who were clearing away the glasses. "It was perfect, wasn't it?" she said, satisfied. He looked at her for a moment. He saw the impeccable woman, smiling, self-assured, but in his mind he couldn't help but see the image of his mother trembling, taking refuge in Lucia's hands. "Yes, perfect," he replied quietly, unconvinced. As Camilla turned to give more orders, Alejandro realized that the social perfection he so admired was beginning to crumble before his eyes. The shadow of his mother's suffering contrasted too sharply with the glamour that Camilla was trying to maintain at all costs. And although he still didn't dare admit it, something inside him was beginning to awaken. The morning dawned calmly in the mansion. After the last reception, the hallways seemed to be resting. The music and laughter had evaporated, leaving only the echo of collected glasses and freshly vacuumed carpets. The air had that scent of sidewalk and wilted flowers that always lingered after a night of luxury. Lucia had been accompanying Doña Mercedes for hours. She had managed to convince her to have breakfast in the small interior garden, a corner protected from the wind and filled with pots of geraniums that the old woman used to contemplate in silence. There, Mercedes felt a little calmer. The bird song and the mid-morning sun were refuges that took her away from the noise. "Look at those red flowers, Doña Mercedes," said Lucia, tucking a light blanket around her legs. "They're just like the ones on your estate, remember?" The old woman tilted her head as if trying to catch a fleeting memory. "The farm," she repeated in a faint voice. "Yes, there were rose bushes. I think they were mine." Lucia smiled and nodded, reinforcing the idea with an affirmative gesture. They were hers. Of course they were. You took better care of them than anyone else. Mercedes seemed to be reassured by that certainty. Her hands, which had been fidgeting on the blanket, stopped. When the old woman focused on watching the sky, Lucia took the opportunity to go to the kitchen to prepare some fresh water. She walked quickly through the hallways, enjoying that brief moment of calm. But when she entered the kitchen, she encountered something she hadn't expected. Camilla was standing by the counter, watching her with a smile that was too calculated. Lucia said in a honeyed tone, "Just the person I wanted to see." The employee stopped dead in her tracks, holding the empty jug. "Yes, Miss Camilla." Alejandro's fiancée walked slowly toward her like an actress measuring each step on a stage. Her heels echoed on the marble floor with a firm cadence. We need to clarify something about your role in this house. Lucia frowned slightly, although she tried to maintain her composure. My job is to take care of Doña Mercedes. Exactly, take care of her. Don't make yourself indispensable. Don't give opinions that no one asked for. And certainly don't contradict me in front of others. Camilla's tone had changed, cold and sharp, although her smile remained fixed on her face. Lucia took a deep breath. She knew the moment she had been avoiding had arrived. With all due respect, miss, she replied slowly, it is not my intention to contradict you. But if someone treats the lady harshly, I cannot remain silent. Camilla's eyes flashed with anger. She took a step closer until the distance between them was minimal. You don't understand how things work here, she said in a low voice, barely more than a venomous whisper. This mansion is my home now, and in my home, I decide what is right for everyone. Lucia clasped the jug between her hands to keep them from shaking. The mansion belongs to Mr. Alejandro and his mother, she replied firmly. And as long as I'm here, I'm going to continue to take care of it as I should. The silence became heavy, almost suffocating. Camilla tilted her head as if assessing her rival. Listen to me carefully, she said, smiling again, although her eyes were cold as steel. If you challenge me again, if you dare to question what I do or say, you will lose your job. Do you understand? Lucia felt a knot in her stomach. She knew she had no family left. Her job at the mansion was her only source of income, but she also knew that a fragile life depended on her. She swallowed hard and held her gaze. I'd rather lose my job than stand by and watch her suffer. Camilla's smile faltered for a moment, revealing her true face. At that moment, a sound in the hallway startled them both. The footsteps were firm and familiar. Alejandro appeared in the kitchen doorway. What's going on here? He asked, frowning. Camilla reacted first, regaining her composure in a matter of seconds and turning to him with an angelic smile. Nothing, honey. I was just explaining to Lucia that she needs to watch her tone a little, so that the house remains harmonious. Lucia opened her mouth to reply, but stopped herself. The memory of the threat still burned in her ears, and the idea of involving Mercedes in a conflict that made her hold back. Alejandro looked at both of them suspiciously. He had felt the tension in the air, but the image in front of him was confusing. Camilla, smiling sweetly, stood silently with her lips pressed together. All right, he finally said in a dry voice. I trust everything is in order. She turned and walked away down the hallway. Silence fell again like a heavy curtain. Camilla smoothed a strand of her hair and leaned slightly toward Lucia before leaving. You see, she murmured maliciously, he believes in me. You're just the employee. The echo of her heels faded down the corridor. Lucia stood still for a moment, breathing heavily, trying to regain control. She felt anger, helplessness, and fear, but also something deeper, a certainty. Her duty was not to remain silent or protect herself, but to protect the woman who trusted her like no one else did. With a firm step, she returned to the garden where Mercedes was still looking at the geraniums. When she saw her, the old woman smiled weakly as if nothing had happened. Lucia sat down beside her and, without saying a word about what had happened, took her hand gently. That simple gesture was her own promise. Whatever happened, she would not leave her alone. The afternoon was drawing to a close with a cool breeze that gently stirred the curtains in the living room. Mercedes was sitting in her favorite armchair by the window overlooking the garden. She had been restless during the morning, but now she seemed more serene, her gaze fixed on the horizon. Lucia entered quietly, carrying a tray with tea and butter cookies that she had prepared especially. She knew that smells and taste sometimes awakened hidden memories. She placed the tray on the coffee table and crouched down in front of the old woman. Doña Mercedes, look what I brought, she said with a gentle smile. The old woman blinked several times and then leaned forward. She picked up a cookie with trembling hands, smelled it, and held it between her fingers as if that simple gesture had opened a door in her memory. My mother used to make cookies like this, she murmured. Lucia didn't respond. She knew she had to let the stream of memories flow on its own. She sat nearby, waiting. Suddenly, Mercedes began to hum a melody so softly that at first it was barely audible. Lucia tilted her head, recognizing the rhythm. It's a song, she asked softly. The old woman nodded, and her voice breaking, began to sing a few words. When the river flows clear and the moon rocks on it, her voice broke, but the emotion remained. Lucia carefully accompanied her, humming along. She had learned that music had a special power, and this melody seemed to spring from the depths of Mercedes's soul. Little by little, the old woman regained her confidence, completing random phrases as if her memory were flashing back. "Who taught you that song, Doña Mercedes?" Lucia asked, taking advantage of the moment of lucidity. The old woman smiled with a sparkle in her eyes that was rarely seen. "He did," she said, her voice filled with tenderness. "He played it on the gaita." "He did," Lucia insisted gently. "My first love," she confessed, lowering her gaze like a shy girl. "A young man who worked on the farm. He had rough hands, but he played like an angel." Lucia felt her skin tingle. The old woman, who sometimes couldn't even remember her own name, was now speaking clearly about a youthful love. Mercedes continued, "My father never approved. He said I deserved a different life and left. But I never forgot that song. Never." Tears welled up in her wrinkled eyes. Lucia took her hand and squeezed it tenderly. "What a beautiful memory, Doña Mercedes. And how wonderful that you still carry it in your heart." It was at that moment that Alejandro appeared in the doorway. He hadn't wanted to interrupt, but his mother's voice had drawn him like a magnet. He stood still, listening with a tight chest. He watched as Lucia patiently accompanied Mercedes, encouraging her to keep singing and bringing that memory to life, even if only for a few minutes. Mercedes laughed through her tears, as if the song had restored her soul's youth. Alejandro had never seen her like this in recent years. When the melody ended, the old woman sighed and closed her eyes, exhausted but at peace. Lucia tucked the blanket around her legs, still holding her hand. Alejandro took a step into the room. "What were they singing?" he asked quietly. Lucia looked at him, surprised to see him there. An old song she remembered. She said a friend taught it to her. Alejandro approached slowly and looked at his sleeping mother. There were dry tears on her cheeks and a faint smile on her lips. He felt a pain in his chest mixed with gratitude. "I can't get her to talk to me like that," he confessed, almost in a whisper. Lucia lowered her gaze. "It's not you, Mr. Alejandro. It's the disease. Sometimes a window opens, and you have to be ready to hear what comes out." He remained silent, watching the old woman breathe calmly while Lucia's hand remained intertwined with his. For the first time, Alejandro understood that this humble young woman understood his mother in a way that he had not, and that certainty moved him more than he wanted to admit. That night, as he walked down the hall to his room, Alejandro couldn't stop thinking about the scene. His mother's voice, her eyes shining as she spoke of a lost love, the way Lucia had listened to her. The contrast struck him. While Camilla was preoccupied with her public image, Lucia was dedicated to rescuing fragments of his mother's soul. For the first time, Alejandro felt that perhaps he had been looking in the wrong direction for too long. The mansion's main dining room was set as if for a gala, even though there were only two people at the table. Camilla had ordered that the porcelain tableware be used for breakfast and that the table be decorated with white lilies in a centerpiece vase. Everything seemed carefully planned to impress, even in private. Alejandro leafed through a newspaper while buttering his bread without much appetite. Camilla, sitting across from him, slowly stirred her coffee, watching him intently. "Alejandro, dear," she finally said in a melodious voice, "I think it's time we stop putting off the inevitable." He looked up, somewhat wearily. "What thing?" "Our wedding," she replied with a broad smile. "We've been engaged for months and everyone knows it. We can't keep putting it off. People are starting to talk." Alejandro put his knife down on his plate and sighed. "We've already discussed this, Camila. My mother's situation, precisely." She interrupted him firmly. "A wedding now would be the perfect opportunity to show that everything is under control, that nothing and no one can stop us." He frowned. "I'm not worried about what people think. I'm worried about my mother. She's not in a position to cope with change." Camilla's smile became more tense. "Alejandro, listen to me carefully. We can't build our future tied to the past. Your mother needs specialized care. I'm not saying this, the doctors are. There are extraordinary centers where she would be cared for day and night. You would be at ease, and so would I. And we could focus on our lives." The phrase echoed in the room. Alejandro looked down at his plate. "Our lives," she repeated almost in a whisper. "Yes," she replied without hesitation. "The two of us. Our family our place in society. The silence lingered, broken only by the faint clinking of Camilla's spoon in her cup. That was when Lucia appeared at the dining room door with a tray of medicine and water for Mercedes. She paused when she noticed the tension, but Camilla had already turned her head toward her. "Lucia, come here for a moment," Camilla said in a tone that was too sweet to sound sincere. "We want your opinion." Lucia moved forward slowly, uncomfortable. "Yes, miss. Alejandro and I were talking about how Doña Mercedes would be better off in a specialized center. Don't you think so too?" Lucia's heart skipped a beat. She had heard rumors of this possibility, but hearing it so directly from Camilla made her grip the tray tightly. "Excuse me," she said at last, her voice calm but firm. "I don't think so. The lady feels safe here in her home. Taking her out of this environment would be very hard for her." Alejandro looked up at the young woman, surprised by her confidence. Camilla smiled, although a flash of anger lit up in her eyes. "You see, Alejandro, even the maid thinks she has the right to decide." Lucia looked down to avoid further confrontation and left quietly. Later, Alejandro found Lucia in the kitchen, peeling fruit on the marble countertop. She looked up cautiously when she heard him enter. "About this morning," he began. "You really think it would be a mistake to take my mother to a center?" Lucia put the knife aside and dried her hands with a cloth. "I'm not saying those places are bad, Mr. Alejandro, but they're not her home. She needs to feel like she's part of something, to feel that she still belongs in her life and yours. If you send her to a facility, she'll feel abandoned, and the emotional damage could be worse than the illness." He remained silent, processing every word. "Camilla insists it would be best for everyone," he finally said. Lucia looked at him calmly, with a frankness that almost no one in that house allowed themselves. Perhaps it would be best for her, but not for her mother. Alejandro looked down. Lucia's clarity struck him in a way he didn't want to admit. That afternoon, in the hallway connecting the bedrooms, Lucia came face to face with Camilla. No one else was nearby. "You're very bold, Lucia," Camilla said, crossing her arms. "Contradicting me in front of Alejandro was not smart." Lucia held her gaze. "I didn't do it to argue with you. I did it because she needs me here." Camilla's expression hardened. "Listen to me carefully," she whispered, leaning toward her. "If you come between Alejandro and me again, if you continue to turn against me, I assure you that you will have no place in this house." Lucia pressed her lips together, holding back her anger and fear. "If losing my place is the price I have to pay for taking care of her, I will pay it." The two stood motionless, facing each other, until a distant noise forced them to move apart. Camilla left with an elegant gait, leaving behind a tense atmosphere. Lucia leaned her back against the wall, breathing deeply. Her heart was pounding, but her decision was firm. Doña Mercedes would not be abandoned as long as she could prevent it. That night, Alejandro went up to his mother's room and found her half asleep with her head resting on Lucia's shoulder. The young woman was reading a passage from a book in a low voice while gently caressing the old woman's hand. Alejandro paused in the doorway watching. Camilla wanted to rush the wedding and get her mother out of the mansion. Lucia, on the other hand, was there, holding her with patience and tenderness. The contrast was becoming increasingly unbearable. The day dawned clear, but the atmosphere in the mansion felt different, as if the air were charged with something no one dared to name. Alejandro descended the stairs with a cup of coffee in his hand, trying to focus on the company's pending issues. However, the conversation with Camilla about sending her mother to a specialized center was still on his mind. As he walked down the main hallway, a murmur coming from the kitchen made him stop. The door was slightly ajar, and he could make out the voices of two employees. "I'm telling you, I saw it with my own eyes," one whispered fearfully. Miss Camilla spoke badly to Doña Mercedes. She told her she was in the way and that she should learn to keep quiet. "Shh, don't go on," the other interrupted her. "Do you want someone to hear us?" "So what?" replied the first. "It's not fair. The poor lady doesn't always understand what's going on. And on top of that, I couldn't stand it." Alejandro stood frozen in the hallway. His heart raced. He pushed the door open gently. The two women turned around immediately, their faces pale as flour. "What are you talking about?" he asked in a neutral tone that concealed his concern. "Grocery shopping, sir," one of them stammered, avoiding his gaze. The other lowered her head and nodded quickly. Alejandro looked at them silently for a few seconds, then simply nodded and walked away with a firm step. But inside him, doubt began to grow like a shadow. Hours later in the library, he called the butler. The man had been in the house for over 20 years. He was discreet and loyal. If anyone could give him an honest answer, it was him. "Tell me the truth," Alejandro began, standing in front of the window. "Have you noticed anything strange in Camilla's behavior toward my mother?" The butler shifted uncomfortably. "Sir, I don't like to talk about things that are none of my business. I'm asking you to be honest." The man looked down, clasping his hands behind his back. "Miss Camilla is a very proper woman in public," but he paused. "Yes, on occasion I have noticed a certain impatience with Doña Mercedes. She treats her in a tone that is not always kind." Alejandro stood motionless. It was a brief confession, but enough to turn his stomach. In the afternoon, Alejandro went for a walk in the gardens to clear his head. The bird song and the scent of the rose bushes failed to calm his mind. In the distance, he heard the voices of two gardeners talking as they worked near the wall. "The lady was crying the other day. After Camilla left her room," one of them said quietly. "Yes, I heard it too," replied the other. "But we'd better not say anything. Anyone here can lose their job for talking too much." Alejandro hid behind a hedge, his heart pounding. He felt like an intruder in his own home, listening to truths that no one dared to say to his face. That night in his study, he poured himself a double whiskey. The fire in the fireplace lit up the room, but he could only see shadows. He sank into the leather armchair and closed his eyes. The phrases he had heard mingled in his mind. "He treats her with contempt. It's not the first time. He's not always kind." The woman was crying. She brought her hands to her face. "No, it can't be," she murmured, as if to convince herself. "It can't be true." Camilla had been the ideal woman in the eyes of the world. He had defended that image. He had staked his social and personal life on her. To admit that everyone was right would be to accept that he had been blind, and Alejandro Herrera had never allowed himself to make a mistake of that magnitude. Later, he went up to his mother's room. He found her asleep, breathing calmly. At her side, Lucia was reading a book aloud, holding the old woman's hand gently. Alejandro paused in the doorway. The scene was simple but revealing. While rumors of abuse and contempt echoed in the hallways, here, in silence, Lucia restored her mother's dignity with a gesture as simple as holding her hand. Lucia looked up and smiled gently at him, without letting go of Mercedes. Alejandro nodded silently in return, then closed the door slowly and walked away. As he walked down the hallway, his doubts became an unbearable weight. Every word he had heard in the mansion, every rumor, every evasive glance from the staff pointed in the same direction. But his pride held him back. He couldn't accept, not yet, that he might have placed his trust in the wrong person. The rumors Alejandro had heard in recent days began to sink into his mind, even though he tried to resist. Perhaps that was why Camilla noticed him becoming more distant and decided to act with greater precision. One afternoon, while Alejandro was reading in the living room, Camilla entered hand in hand with Doña Mercedes. She led her slowly, almost theatrically, as if she were a fragile child who needed to be guided at every step. "Isn't that right, Doña Mercedes?" Camilla said, leaning toward the old woman with an overly broad smile. "Let's sit here with your son." Mercedes looked at her, confused, but obeyed. Camilla settled her into an armchair and put her arm around her shoulders. "It's so sweet to have you with us," she added, stroking her hair with a gesture that seemed more like a pose than a sincere act. Alejandro looked up from his book. The scene baffled him. His fiancée had never shown such tenderness toward his mother in public. "Thank you, Camilla," he said in a low voice, though inside he felt a strange sense of unease. Camilla smiled with satisfaction. Later, when Alejandro left the room to take a call, Camilla's demeanor changed in an instant. She abruptly removed her arm from Mercedes's shoulders and stood up impatiently. "How annoying, always looking at me with that lost expression," she muttered under her breath. Mercedes blinked in alarm. "I don't want to. I don't want to bother you." "Then don't," Camilla said in a sharp whisper before turning on her heels and leaving the room. What she didn't know was that Lucia had just entered through the side door carrying a tray of tea. She stopped short, her heart sinking, and looked at the anguished expression on Mercedes's face. She set the tray on the table, knelt beside her, and stroked her hands. "Calm down, Doña Mercedes. It's over. I'm here." Mercedes looked at her with teary eyes like a child seeking refuge. From that day on, Lucia made a decision. She had to gather evidence. It wasn't enough to confront Camilla in private. If she really wanted to protect the old woman, she needed clear evidence. She started carrying a small notebook in her apron pocket. Every time she witnessed a cruel comment or a harsh gesture, she wrote it down in detail. Date, time, exact words. Some nights, while everyone was asleep, she wrote entire pages in tight handwriting, describing scenes she couldn't allow to be forgotten. She also began to use her phone discreetly. A couple of times she managed to record audio from the kitchen when Camilla, thinking she was alone with Mercedes, spoke harshly to her. Meanwhile, Camilla intensified her performance in front of Alejandro. One morning she came down to the dining room with Mercedes on her arm. She had dressed her in an elegant shawl and put a flower in her hair. "Look how beautiful your mother is today," she said with a radiant smile. "I wanted to dress her up a little so she could have breakfast with us." Alejandro smiled in surprise, although he couldn't help noticing that Mercedes seemed uncomfortable. "You look great, Mom," he said, stroking her hand. The old woman nodded weakly, not daring to speak. Camilla took the opportunity to kiss her on the forehead and whisper in a tone that only Alejandro could hear. "It's a treasure to have her with us, my love, and she always will be." Alejandro was moved, but deep in his mind the rumor still echoed. That afternoon in the kitchen, Lucia added another note to the notebook. Camilla dressed her and took her to the dining room. In front of Alejandro, she smiled and kissed her. But Mercedes was stiff, fear in her eyes. She didn't say a word. She closed the notebook and carefully put it in her pocket. She knew she was playing a dangerous game. If anyone found out what she was doing, it could cost her her job. But she also knew that there were lives worth more than any salary. And although the mansion seemed to continue with its glittering routine, a silent clash was raging within its walls, growing ever more intense. Camilla's impeccable mask versus the invisible marks she left on Mercedes's soul. Lucia saw everything, wrote everything down, kept everything, because sooner or later the truth had to come out. The afternoon had turned gray over the mansion. The sky was covered with thick clouds and the heavy air seemed to foreshadow a storm. Mercedes sat in her room, distractedly leafing through a photo album that Lucia had left on the table, trying to cling to faces that were fading from her memory. The door burst open. Camilla entered unannounced, with a firm step and a stern expression. "Doña Mercedes," she said in a voice that was sweet on the surface but had a hidden edge. "You can't have all this in such a mess. You keep taking the photos out, then you drop them, and then no one knows who they belong to." Mercedes blinked in confusion. "They're mine. Everything in this house belongs to Alejandro," Camilla corrected, snatching the album from her hands. "And you should understand that." The old woman trembled, searching for the words that escaped her. "I don't want them to take it away from me." Camilla placed the album roughly on the desk. "Then behave yourself. No one has time to pick up what you throw away." Her voice was low, but the tone was enough to cause panic. Mercedes began to breathe rapidly, bringing her hands to her chest. "No, no, no," she suddenly screamed, her eyes wide. Camilla recoiled, startled by the intensity of the reaction. At that moment, Lucia entered with a tray of tea. Seeing the scene, she dropped the tray on the dresser and ran to the old woman. "Doña Mercedes," she exclaimed, kneeling beside her. "Breathe with me here. Calm down. Look into my eyes. Don't be afraid. I'm here with you." Mercedes was shaking, her body racked with spasms of anxiety. "Will you get me out of here? Will you get me out of here?" she screamed as if the walls were closing in on her. Lucia hugged her tightly, humming softly to calm her down. Camilla moved away toward the door, her face tense. "She's exaggerating. She always exaggerates," she muttered, before rushing out. The commotion reached Alejandro's ears. He ran up the stairs two at a time, his heart racing, entered the room, and found the scene. His mother was clinging to Lucia's arm, trembling, and the young woman was trying to calm her down. "What happened?" he asked in a firm voice, although his expression was one of confusion. Lucia looked up, sweating from the effort of restraining the old woman. "An anxiety attack, sir, but it will pass. Leave her with me." Alejandro knelt on the other side of the bed, stroking his mother's hair. "Mom, it's me. Calm down. I'm here." Mercedes looked at him for a few seconds, but did not seem to recognize him. Her eyes were clouded with fear. "Don't leave me. Don't leave me." she implored, clinging more tightly to Lucia than to her own son. That gesture hurt Alejandro like a dagger. He looked at Lucia for answers, but she only returned his gaze with urgency and tenderness. She needs to feel safe. Don't try to reason with her now. Just come with us, she said. He obeyed, even though he was consumed by helplessness. The minutes seemed like an eternity. Little by little, with Lucia's melody and soft words repeated over and over, Mercedes's breathing began to stabilize. Her eyelids closed and, exhausted, she fell asleep in the young woman's arms. Lucia sighed with relief, stroking her hair until she was sure she was calm. Alejandro remained seated in silence, frowning and staring at his mother. Why? Why is this happening? He finally asked, his voice breaking. Lucia hesitated before answering. Sometimes words can hurt more than anything else. She is very sensitive. When she feels rejected or threatened, her mind is lost in fear. Alejandro frowned even more. What do you mean? Did someone make her feel that way? Lucia looked at him with a silence that said more than any words. She did not dare to accuse anyone directly, but she could not pretend indifference either. Alejandro understood the implication and clenched his fists. That night, as the mansion sank into silence, Alejandro remained in his study, unable to concentrate. The image of his mother screaming desperately haunted him. The way she had clung to Lucia instead of him had affected him more than he wanted to admit. He was beginning to feel caught between two realities. The one Camilla showed him with perfect smiles, and the one he saw reflected in his mother's terrified eyes. Something was about to break, and he sensed it. The rain fell in thick curtains on the mansion's windows, darkening the afternoon. Alejandro had finished a meeting that was supposed to last until nightfall earlier than expected. He decided not to announce his return. He wanted to surprise his mother with an unexpected visit. The chauffeur dropped him off at the entrance, and he walked down the dimly lit hallway, enjoying for a moment the strange silence that only rain brings. He climbed the stairs with a determined stride, thinking he would find his mother resting. But when he reached the second-floor hallway, a sound stopped him in his tracks. It wasn't music or the voices of employees. It was a harsh, sharp tone full of rage. "That's enough," he heard from his mother's room. Alejandro tensed up, moved forward quietly, and as he got closer, Camilla's voice became clearer, coming through the half-open door. "I can't stand this. Do you understand? You're a nuisance." She spoke with a harshness she had never used in front of him. Alejandro stood motionless, his heart pounding. He pushed the door open, just enough to see, and the scene that appeared before his eyes froze him. Camilla was standing next to the bed, her arms akimbo and her face tense. Doña Mercedes, huddled under the blankets, was rocking back and forth with trembling hands. "You're a nuisance every second," Camilla continued, leaning toward the old woman. "If it were up to me, you'd already be in a center where no one would have to put up with you." Mercedes tried to cover herself with the blanket, murmuring through her tears, "I don't want to be a nuisance. I don't." Alejandro felt a lump in his throat. Each word fell like a whip on his mother. He slammed the door open. "Camilla." She turned immediately. Her face was still contorted with rage. But as soon as she saw him, she tried to compose herself. "I'll go, love. It's not what it looks like." She stammered, her voice thick with nerves. Alejandro walked over to the bed, ignoring her. He knelt beside his mother and took her hands. "Mom, calm down. I'm here now," he whispered, stroking her hair. Mercedes looked at him with tears in her eyes, like a helpless child who had finally found refuge. Alejandro looked up at Camilla. Her eyes were two burning embers. "Is this what you do when I'm not here?" he asked in a low, restrained, dangerous voice. Camilla reached out to him, pleading. "No, you don't understand. She drives me crazy, Ale. You don't know how hard it is. I just want to help you. I want to help you." "Help me," he repeated with icy disbelief. Just like that, humiliating my mother, Camilla took a step toward him, whimpering. "I'm doing it for us," she said in a broken voice. "You don't know the pressure I feel, how exhausting it is. I love you, Alejandro. Everything I do is out of love." "Enough," his voice thundered, echoing off the walls. Mercedes shuddered, squeezing her son's hand tighter. Alejandro stood up, his face hardened. "I opened the doors of my house to you. I trusted you, and this is what you do." Camilla tried to approach him, but he raised his hand in a gesture that stopped her in her tracks. Never come near my mother again. The silence that followed was so thick that the rain against the windows seemed like thunder. Camilla blinked, her makeup running from the fake tears that were now streaming from her eyes. Alejandro, no, I love you. Don't do this to me. But he didn't answer. He turned to his mother, who was still sobbing, and knelt down beside her again. It's okay, Mom. It's over now. No one will ever treat you like that again. I promise. Camilla backed away to the door, defeated, not knowing whether to insist or leave. Alejandro didn't even look at her. The sound of the rain filled the room like a final curtain. For the first time, there was no room for doubt. The echo of the storm could still be heard in the mansion's windows. Although the rain had subsided, the hallways were permeated with the smell of dampness and wet earth coming in from the garden. Alejandro left his mother's room, his heart still racing. She was finally sleeping peacefully, clutching Lucia's hand, but the memory of what he had seen minutes before consumed him like fire under his skin. When he opened the door to the hallway, Camilla was there. She was waiting for him, leaning against the staircase railing, her eyes red and her makeup smudged. When she saw him, she stood up and walked toward him with unsteady steps. Alejandro, she whispered, her voice thick with tears. Please, you have to listen to me. He stopped a few feet away and didn't move. I've seen what I needed to see, he replied in a serious tone, harsher than he had intended. Camilla raised her hands as if to touch him, but Alejandro took a step back. The pleading in her eyes mingled with the desperation of someone who knows that control is slipping away. Don't reject me like this, she exclaimed. Everything I do is for you. Don't you understand? For us. Alejandro clenched his fists. His voice came out restrained, laden with pent-up rage. For us, is that what you call love? You humiliated my mother, Camila. You made her feel like she was a nuisance in her own home. Do you know what it means to see her like that? Camilla trembled, but instead of backing away, she hardened her gaze. Your mother is a burden, Alejandro. She spat suddenly with brutal coldness. She has been from the beginning, and everyone knows it. Silence fell like a blow. Alejandro felt the air catch in his throat. Be careful what you say, he murmured in a dangerous voice. But she continued, now liberated, as if the masks had fallen away completely. You are a respected, powerful man with a bright future. And what are you doing locked up in this mansion, wasting your life with a woman who doesn't even recognize you? I've been the only one brave enough to tell you. Alejandro closed his eyes for a second. When he opened them, the decision had already been made. The woman you're talking about is my mother. His voice was sharp as a knife. And if you can't understand that, you should never have been in my life. Camilla laughed bitterly, a short, broken laugh. You're naive, Alejandro. I thought you were stronger than that. I thought you would see beyond the weakness. He moved toward her slowly without looking away. Don't confuse compassion with weakness. What makes me strong is defending her from people like you. Camilla's expression changed. The pleading turned into pure arrogance. And what will society say when they find out? She asked with a venomous gleam in her eyes. Everyone knows about our engagement. If you break it off now, you'll become a laughingstock. I'd rather be a laughingstock, he replied firmly, than a man who allowed his mother to be mistreated in her own home. Camilla took a step back, her pride wounded. Are you going to humiliate me like this? Her voice broke with rage. I've invested everything in this relationship, in building an image alongside you, and this is how you repay me. Alejandro shook his head slowly. It's not about image, Camilla. It's about truth. And the truth is that it's over between us. The engagement ends here. The words echoed in the hallway like a final verdict. For a moment, Camilla was silent, looking at him as if she could still reverse it, but then her face changed again. There were no more tears, no more pleading, no more sweetness. All that remained was the cold, calculating, vengeful look she had kept hidden for too long. You're going to regret this, Alejandro Herrera, she whispered with a venom that cut deep into the air. You don't know what I'm capable of. He held her gaze without blinking. Don't threaten me. His voice was icy. You have no power here anymore. This house is no longer yours. Camilla breathed heavily, her lips pressed tightly together. Finally, she turned on her heels and descended the stairs with heavy steps. Each click of her heels echoed like a definitive breakup. Alejandro was left alone in the hallway, feeling the emptiness left by the confrontation. His chest burned with rage and pain, but also with a new certainty. The decision had been made. The relationship had collapsed forever. The day had passed slowly in the mansion. After the storm and the accumulated tension, the atmosphere felt strange, as if the walls themselves had absorbed the silence of those who inhabited them. In Doña Mercedes's room, the curtains swayed gently in the afternoon breeze. The scent of the band permeated the air thanks to a small bag that Lucia had hung near the window. The old woman sat in her favorite armchair with a shawl over her shoulders, staring out at the garden. Lucia, patient as always, brushed her hair with slow, deliberate movements, with the delicacy of someone who knows that this simple act can become a refuge. "Do you like how it looks, Doña Mercedes?" she asked, smiling as she held up a small mirror. Mercedes looked at herself with surprise, as if she didn't quite recognize herself, but then nodded slowly. "My mother used to comb my hair like this," she said in a faint voice. Lucia held back the emotion in her throat. She had learned that these little windows into memories were fleeting treasures that had to be held on to with all one's soul. At that moment, Alejandro entered quietly. He had spent the whole day restless, with thoughts he couldn't sort out, but he needed to see her. He needed to be there. The scene stopped him in his tracks. His mother, her hair pulled back, more serene than usual, stood beside her, radiating calm. "Mr. Alejandro," Lucia said when she saw him, bowing her head slightly. "She's much calmer today than she was yesterday." He approached slowly, kneeling in front of the old woman. He took her hands in his, noticing the faint but real warmth of her skin. "Mom, how are you feeling?" he asked softly. Mercedes looked at him. Her eyes, so often dull, had a different sparkle, as if the fog of illness had lifted for a moment. "Alejandro," she said clearly, pronouncing each syllable with effort. He swallowed. "I'm here, Mom." She squeezed his hands with a strength she didn't usually have. Then she turned her head toward Lucia, who stood waiting expectantly. She took a deep breath, as if she had to gather all the energy in her life to say what she was about to say. "Take care of her, Alejandro." Her voice broke, but she recovered. "Because when I no longer remember you, she will be the one to remind me of who I was." Time seemed to stand still. Alejandro felt a shiver run through his entire body. The phrase hit him with the force of a revelation. "Mom," he murmured, tears welling up in his eyes, "please don't say that." Mercedes looked at him tenderly, a faint smile on her face. "Don't cry, son. She will help you remember me." Lucia, her eyes moist, knelt down too, placing a hand on the old woman's. She didn't speak. She understood that this moment needed no words, only presence. Alejandro rested his forehead on his mother's hands, unable to hold back his tears. "I promise you, Mom, she will never lack respect or affection. Never." Mercedes sighed deeply, as if those words had lifted a weight from her shoulders. She closed her eyes and let herself drift off to rest, but still with an expression of serenity on her face. That night, none of the three wanted to break the circle. Lucia remained by the bed with the music box in her lap. When she turned it on, the melody filled the room with a nostalgic sweetness. Mercedes murmured fragments of the song, her words fading in and out between dreams. Lucia accompanied her with a soft hum, and Alejandro, sitting to one side, simply listened, his face wet with tears. Each note seemed to be etched into his memory, along with the phrase his mother had uttered. "When I no longer remember you, she will be the one to remind me of who I was." It was a truth that was both painful and luminous. In that room, under the dim light of the lamp, Alejandro understood that those words would become the compass for everything that would come after. The mansion dawned differently. After the last tremors, it seemed that even the walls breathed calmly, as if silence had fallen to protect what was happening inside. There were no abrupt orders, no echo of heels dominating the hallways, no veiled arguments in the kitchen, only the serenity of a house that was slowly returning to those who truly inhabited it. In the master bedroom, Doña Mercedes still slept with a peaceful expression on her face. The sun filtered timidly through the curtains and bathed the shawl covering her shoulders in golden light. Alejandro remained seated on one side of the bed, watchful, as if he feared that something might break if he looked away. In front of him, Lucia rested in a chair. She had spent the entire night in the room, unwilling to move. Sleep had overcome her only for a few moments, always with the music box on her lap, like an amulet, her eyelids drooping, her posture hunched, her hands still close to those of the old woman. Everything about her conveyed a silent devotion. Alejandro watched her for a long time. He had never looked at Lucia that way before, never with that mixture of gratitude and revelation. She had been invisible to him for too long, as if she were a necessary shadow in the house, until he understood that it was his mother who clung to that shadow so as not to lose herself completely. With an instinctive gesture, he got up, took a light blanket, and placed it over Lucia's shoulders. She slowly opened her eyes and looked at him in surprise. "I'm sorry," she whispered, settling herself. "I didn't mean to fall asleep." Alejandro smiled gently. "You don't have to apologize. You've done more than anyone else." Lucia looked down, uncomfortable with the compliment. "I'm just doing my job." He shook his head slowly. "No, Lucia, it's not just your job. It's much more than that." A couple of hours later, Mercedes woke up. Her breathing was calm, and for a moment she seemed to recognize her son's presence. Alejandro leaned over and took her hand gently. "Mom," he said in a low, trembling voice, "I need you to listen to me." She looked at him intently with a glimmer of lucidity that rarely appeared. "Tell me, son." Alejandro swallowed, squeezing her wrinkled hand against his. "I promise you'll never be in the wrong hands again. I swear." Mercedes's eyes moistened and a sigh escaped her lips. "That's enough for me, Alejandro. That's enough for me, Shell." He closed his eyes, holding back tears. "And I also want to acknowledge something." He continued, turning to Lucia. "This woman is not just your caregiver, Mom. She is the one who has protected you more loyally than anyone else." Lucia, surprised, blinked and shook her head. "Don't say that, Mr. Alejandro. I'm just—" He interrupted her firmly, though his voice was heavy with emotion. "You're not just an employee. You've been my mother's refuge when I wasn't there. You're part of her. And now you're part of me, too." Lucia fell silent. Tears began to well up, though she tried to hide them by bowing her head. Alejandro moved closer and took her hand, placing it next to his mother's. "Thank you," he said hoarsely. "You have no idea what you've done for us." Mercedes, still aware of the moment, pressed her two hands together, uniting her son and Lucia in that gesture. "That's how it should be," she murmured tenderly. United, the rest of the day turned into a silent truce. Alejandro ordered that no one disturb his mother, that there be no visitors or interruptions. The mansion, accustomed to parties and receptions, was reduced to the bare essentials. 3 people in one room sharing the burden of illness and the comfort of companionship. In the afternoon, they took Mercedes to the interior garden. They sat her in a comfortable armchair, covered with a blanket. The fresh air cheered her up, and her eyes lit up when she heard the birds singing. Lucia sat down next to her, holding the music box, turned it gently, and let the melody fill the space. Mercedes smiled weakly, murmuring the words of a song she had once known by heart. Alejandro, sitting across from them, watched them with a heavy heart. He understood then that the promise he had made was not only an oath to his mother, but also to Lucia, to care for her, to protect what she represented, to recognize her as the pillar that kept the most valuable thing in his life safe. When he took both their hands and held them intertwined, he closed his eyes. "This will never be broken," he said in a clear voice. It was more than a commitment, it was an eternal promise. The mansion had regained a calm that seemed unfamiliar. There were no receptions or fake voices echoing through the hallways. The air was different, lighter, though still permeated with the recent traces of the storm. Alejandro walked through the library alone. The bookshelves filled with books, his father's legacy, watched him like silent judges. He took a glass of wine and sat down in front of the window. Outside, the afternoon was slowly falling over the gardens. His mind couldn't stray from the same question. How did I not see it before? Camilla had been the perfect woman in everyone's eyes, elegant, brilliant, always smiling in public. And he, Alejandro Herrera, had convinced himself that this image was enough, that the glamour of appearances could sustain an entire life. Now, remembering it, he felt angry with himself. He had defended that illusion with such pride that he had failed to hear what was most important. His mother's gestures, her inexplicable fears, Lucia's heavy silences. He tapped the table gently with his clenched fist. I was blind, he murmured with a pain he made no attempt to hide. That night, as he passed his mother's room, he ran into Lucia coming out with a folded blanket in her arms. Is she asleep yet? Alejandro asked. Lucia nodded. Yes, she's calm. She was calm today. The music helped a lot. He smiled slightly, but his expression remained marked by melancholy. Can I accompany you to the garden for a moment? He said suddenly. Lucia hesitated but nodded. The night air was cool and heavy with the scent of jasmine. They walked silently to a stone bench under the trees. Alejandro sat down first. Lucia sat next to him. For a moment, neither of them spoke. It was he who broke the silence. I've been thinking about everything that happened and how I let myself be fooled. It wasn't just because of Camilla, it was because of myself, because it was easier to believe in perfection than to see what was right in front of my eyes. Lucia glanced at him but didn't interrupt. My mother, Alejandro continued, lowering his voice. Even in her fragility, she always sensed it. I denied it, but she knew. Maybe because the heart sees what reason doesn't want to accept. Silence fell again, broken only by the rustling of the leaves. Lucia sighed and placed the blanket on her lap. You know, she said softly, when I was caring for my grandmother, I had moments like that too. She could go hours without recognizing me, lost in a world that no one understood, but then suddenly a gesture, a word, a song, and she would see me again. It was like a flash of lightning that illuminated everything for an instant. Alejandro watched her closely. And how did you cope? He asked. Lucia smiled sadly. It wasn't easy. There were days when I felt I had lost her forever, but I learned that those moments of lucidity were gifts. I had to treasure them, even if they were brief, because there she was, reminding me of who she had been. Alejandro was thoughtful. That's exactly what happened with my mother, he said in a whisper. Her words, that sentence, were as if time had stopped, as if she were giving me her truth before it faded away again. Lucia looked at him intently with silent compassion. Love always finds a way, even in the midst of confusion. For the first time in a long time, Alejandro felt he could speak without the armor of his pride. Lucia, I've made so many mistakes, I let myself be carried away by what others saw in me. And meanwhile, the most important thing was forgotten here. She placed a hand on his. Don't punish yourself. What matters is that you're here now and that Doña Mercedes knows it, even if she can't always say it. The warmth of that gesture washed over him. He closed his eyes for a moment, letting the night breeze envelop him. Inside, he felt that he was beginning to heal. When they returned inside before saying goodbye in the hallway, Alejandro paused. Thank you for sharing that about your grandmother. It helps me understand and not feel so lost. Lucia smiled humbly. I've felt lost many times too, but I've learned that sometimes being there is more important than solving problems. He nodded and for the first time looked at her, not only as the woman who took care of his mother, but as someone who held part of his own life. That night, as he lay down in his room, Alejandro heard his mother's voice in his mind again. She will be the one to remind me of who I was, and he understood that those words were not only a warning but also a guide. Lucia was there not only for Mercedes but also for him. The news spread like wildfire. All it took was a public appearance by Camila Guzman without her engagement ring for the entire social circle to begin speculating. There was no official statement, but the rumors traveled faster than any truth. In a matter of hours, Alejandro Herrera, until then a model of success and elegance, became the subject of the city's juiciest conversations. Magazine headlines spoke of an unexpected breakup, an abrupt decision, and a man dominated by family circumstances. In the photographs, Camilla appeared impeccable, with calculated gestures of melancholy and ambiguous statements to reporters. Love is not always enough, she replied with a sad smile, leaving others to fill in the story. Alejandro, meanwhile, was hearing the stories from third parties. A partner called him early in the morning. Alejandro, tell me it's not true, he said urgently. They say you broke off the engagement. Alejandro sighed. It's true. There was a long silence on the other end of the line. But how? We were all counting on that wedding. It was the event of the year. Do you know what this means for your image? Alejandro clenched his jaw. I know. And I also know that my image is not worth more than my mother. The partner snorted in frustration. You were always proud, but this is social suicide. Alejandro hung up without answering. It didn't take long for the comments to reach the clubs and private gatherings. One night at a business dinner, an acquaintance approached him with a false look of complicity. Alejandro, man, I know your mother is sick, but was all this necessary? You could have waited a little, pretended until the worst was over. He looked him straight in the eye. My mother is not something to be pretended. She's not a nuisance or an accessory to be hidden away to look good to anyone. The murmur at the table became uncomfortable. Some looked down, others whispered quietly. Alejandro remained upright in silence. The following days were a succession of trials. The newspapers devoted pages to the breakup, speculating about the pressure Mercedes' illness had put on the relationship. Some insinuated that Alejandro was allowing himself to be dragged down by the past, missing opportunities. Others described him as a noble man, but one doomed to sacrifice. The letter from his partners arrived on the third day. It was signed by several influential names. In careful language, they asked him to reconsider the situation, to think about the stability of the circle, and not to let personal emotions compromise the Herrera family legacy. Alejandro read every word calmly, then folded the letter and left it on the table. At that moment, Lucia entered with a tray of tea. She watched him silently before asking, "What do they say? That they're concerned about my image?" He replied with bitter irony. Mercedes, who was in the next room, looked up when she heard him. "And what do you say, son?" Alejandro walked over to her, took her hand, and smiled serenely. "I'd rather lose my image than lose you, Mom." That same weekend, Camilla appeared at a charity gala, surrounded by cameras, dressed impeccably, and responded with ambiguous phrases that seemed to have been written for her. "I don't hold a grudge. I just hope that one day he understands what he lost." The next day, the magazines picked up her words and contrasted them with Alejandro's silence, painting him as a cold and distant man. But Alejandro did not come out to defend himself. He did not give interviews. He did not issue statements. Instead, he stayed in the mansion, walking with his mother in the garden, listening to her fragmented songs, sharing silences with Lucia. Society interpreted this as weakness. For him, it was the first time in years that he had felt free. One night, in his study, in front of the window illuminated by the city, he reflected. He had lost prestige, contacts, a comfortable position in the game of appearances, but at the same time he had gained something that no one in those salons could buy, the certainty of having chosen the right thing. His mother's words came back to him with serene force. "She will be the one to remind me of who I was." Even in her fragility, she had seen what he, with all his supposed intelligence, had been unable to see. And in that moment, he understood. He had not said goodbye only to Camilla, nor to the glittering salons. He had said goodbye to a life of masks. He was finally a man free of his own pride. The mansion, which for months had been the scene of tension and uncomfortable silences, began to transform little by little, not with big visible changes, but with simple details that altered the atmosphere of the place. Soft laughter in the hallways, old melodies playing on the radio, the smell of freshly baked bread escaping from the kitchen. Alejandro was the first to notice. One morning as he was coming down the stairs, he heard his mother humming a song in the dining room. She wasn't alone. Lucia accompanied her, clapping softly to the rhythm, as if they were two girls sharing a secret game. Alejandro stopped to watch from the doorway. Doña Mercedes, wrapped in a blue shawl, clapped awkwardly, following the beat, while Lucia encouraged her with a sincere smile. "Very good, Doña Mercedes." "Again," said the young woman, laughing. "Like that? Look, more slowly." The old woman imitated her, squinting her eyes with effort, but with a spark of joy she hadn't shown in a long time. Alejandro felt a part of his chest, the part that had been hardened by weeks of uncertainty, soften as he watched the scene. The following days became a small laboratory of tenderness. Lucia and Alejandro began to organize routines that gave Mercedes stability. In the mornings, they walked together in the garden, always with the music box in hand. Lucia played it in moments of confusion, and Mercedes responded with smiles or broken words. At noon, they prepared simple recipes from her youth: chicken broth, rice pudding, butter cookies. Sometimes Mercedes recognized the flavors and, in flashes of lucidity, recounted anecdotes lost in time. In the evenings, Alejandro read her excerpts from books they had once shared. Although she rarely followed the story, she seemed to find comfort in the tone of his voice. One afternoon, while Mercedes was napping, Lucia and Alejandro met in the kitchen. She was kneading bread with flour on her hands and a strand of hair loose on her forehead. He leaned against the door frame and watched her in silence. "I didn't know you were also a baker," he joked with a smile. Lucia looked up in surprise. "My grandmother taught me. She said kneading calms the soul, and I think she was right." Alejandro approached her. He took a little flour and gently rubbed it on her cheek. Lucia looked at him, amused and nervous. "Mr. Alejandro, you're going to get dirty." "It doesn't matter," he replied without looking away. For a second, the atmosphere changed. They were no longer employer and employee, but two people finding respite in the midst of pain. Lucia looked down, picking up the dough again with trembling hands. That same night, while they were having dinner, Mercedes suddenly looked up and said clearly, "This feels like home." Alejandro and Lucia looked at each other, moved. It was a simple phrase, but it contained everything they had been trying to build. As the days passed, the mansion began to fill with little rituals. Fresh flowers on the table, candles lit at sunset, old songs hummed softly. Alejandro discovered that these details were not secondary. They were the refuge that gave his mother moments of calm. Lucia, for her part, noticed that Alejandro himself was changing. His gestures were more patient, his words softer, his time more devoted to the essential. One night, as he stepped out onto the balcony after putting Mercedes to bed, he sighed deeply. Lucia said without looking at him, "I never imagined that peace could be found in such simple things." She looked at him with a slight smile. "Simple things have always been what sustain life, Miss Alejandro. Only sometimes we forget that." He turned his head and met her eyes. For the first time, he felt that the different future that was just beginning to emerge in small gestures could be real. A new beginning. The afternoon fell over the mansion with a warm glow that tinged the windows with orange. Lucia had been tidying up one of the old wardrobes in Mercedes's room, where boxes of memories, yellowed photos, and small, forgotten objects had accumulated. The old woman was sleeping on the couch, wrapped in her blanket, while Alejandro was looking through some papers near the window. When she removed an embroidered handkerchief, Lucia found a small wooden box covered in dust. She picked it up carefully. It was the size of a hand and was decorated with delicate engravings of flowers, now worn by time. "What is that?" asked Alejandro, approaching curiously. Lucia blew the dust off and showed him the object. "It looks like a music box. It's quite old." Mercedes, upon hearing the phrase, slowly opened her eyes. A little box whispered as if that word had ignited something inside her. Lucia knelt beside her and placed the box on her knees. "It's yours, Doña Mercedes." The old woman caressed the wood with trembling fingers. For a moment, her eyes filled with a glimmer of recognition. "My father gave it to me when I was a child," she murmured in a broken voice. Alejandro held his breath. His mother did not usually string together such specific memories. Lucia looked for the small key on the side and turned it gently. A click sounded, and immediately the melody began to fill the room. Delicate notes, an old raft that seemed to bring with it echoes of another time. Mercedes brought her hands to her chest. That song whispered, closing her eyes, and in a low voice, almost a murmur, she began to hum fragments of forgotten lyrics. Alejandro stood motionless, his throat tight. He hadn't heard his mother sing in years. Lucia, moved, accompanied the rhythm by moving her head slightly. "What a beautiful melody," she said softly. Mercedes smiled. It was a different smile, pure, as if for a moment she had regained not only the memory, but also the emotion of her youth. For several minutes, the little box continued to turn, repeating its melody. Alejandro couldn't take his eyes off his mother. It was as if the disease had receded, as if the music had opened a crack in her memory. "Mom," he said softly, "do you remember it?" She looked at him with a tenderness that pierced him. "I danced to it so many times," she replied, and a tear rolled down her cheek. Lucia gently wiped her face. "She still remembers it, even if it's only in her heart," she whispered. Alejandro put a hand to his chest, holding back the tremor in his voice. "Thank you, Lucia, for finding her, for giving her this gift." She looked at him, and in her eyes there were tears, but also a quiet pride. That night, before going to sleep, Mercedes asked them to leave the little box on her nightstand so she could sing to me. When I close my eyes, she said, caressing it affectionately. Alejandro and Lucia settled her into bed and remained silent for a moment, listening to the echo of the melody that still floated in the room. And although they knew that the next day the illness could cloud everything again, that afternoon remained etched in their minds as a reminder. Even in the midst of loss, there are memories that survive in the heart, impossibles to erase. The mansion's garden was in full bloom. The rose bushes spread their petals as if they wanted to offer the world a respite. The air was perfumed with jasmine, and birdsong accompanied every step. That afternoon, Alejandro decided there would be no compromises, just a walk. He took his mother by one arm while Lucia held the other. Mercedes walked slowly and serenely. In her hands, she carried the music box as if it were a newly discovered treasure. Lucia turned the key and the melody filled the air. The old woman smiled, murmuring fragments of that old song. For the first time in a long time, Alejandro did not think about business or rumors. He looked at his mother, fragile and luminous. He looked at Lucia, patient and tender, and he understood. True wealth was there in compassion, in genuine love, in those who remain when everyone else walks away. They stopped under an old oak tree. Mercedes took Lucia's hand and murmured, "Thank you." Lucia smiled with tears in her eyes. Alejandro watched, moved. At sunset, they sat in front of the white lilies. The little box continued to play, and time seemed to stand still in that gesture of unity. "This is our true home," said Alejandro. "This is where what matters remains." Mercedes, hugging the little box, whispered like a blessing. Together, always together. And the three of them went inside. The story needed nothing more than that. A walk in the garden, a melody that survived oblivion, and the certainty that greatness lies in the ability to remain, love, and protect. Thank you for being with us until the end. Don't forget to subscribe, leave your like, and share your opinion and the country from which you are watching us in the comments. We'll meet again in the next story. M.